For myself, I think it was really good to speak to some people that obviously we usually wouldn't meet in normal circumstances, especially being up north. We're not quite central. So it was nice to kind of get our opinions and our views across and to feel like they've been heard.
I think it's just speaking to the professionals at the end, so the pop-up signs that you had were fab, which they would have seen online, would they?
I think you just can't beat coming here in person and being able to talk to loads of people that are here and ask all the questions that you need to ask. There's so many benefits to it. You meet lots of people and it's just a really lovely feeling of camaraderie and interactivity.
So coming here, I feel like I've kind of felt like that I'm not alone in stuff that I'm going through at placement, and from what I've taken away from this is how to go about situations, how to make it better, and how to feel well supported as well. We had some top tips given, so going into placement, I definitely take them on board and try and make the most out of my learning experience.
For me, the main reason I wanted to come was for that networking, for finding my people, the people that are interested in learning about the same things that I'm interested in, and taking those away and sharing them, and because we're on Midwifery Society at our university, and just kind of sharing those with our fellow colleagues and everything. So yeah,
I'm going to be looking back at the things that we've gone through, because there was a lot of content. But I think the joys of now that we can meet face to face, so that's why we really wanted to be here face to face. There is something about meeting other people. So yeah, next time sign up, definitely.
The Maternity and Midwifery Forum brings you Matflix, video streaming from maternity experts. All your CPD and revalidation needs met in one place. Our expertly curated box sets are the perfect way to engage with the latest thinking, issue by issue. They make revalidation easy and are the perfect accompaniment to any project or university coursework. In addition to video from expert speakers across maternity and midwifery, there is easily accessible research and links to the latest government policy documents. Our reflective questions at the end are the perfect primer for your revalidation. In the same way the Maternity and Midwifery Forum provides certificates to show that you have attended these festivals, We can provide certificates for those who have consumed the content of a box set and submitted their written answers to the reflective questions provided by our curator, Dr. Jenny Hall. Midwives, maternity professionals and students, do not miss out. Subscribe to Matflix today.
Box sets are now available via Open Athens and other international federated access with library institutional subscription.
Check out the box sets at www.matflix.co.uk.
And welcome everyone to this week's Maternity and Midwifery Hour. It's season 11, session 2. Welcome back. And welcome to those of you who might be new to us. It's lovely that you've joined us, and I hope you're going to enjoy this evening. I think, well, I know you will. Everyone enjoys the Maternity and Midwifery Hour, and you will. We're joined tonight by Debbie Garrod and Mark Williams, except Mark Williams is going to be a sort of virtual Mark Williams because his kind of day job is he's doing a group at this very second, so can't be with us. And I think he was very sad not to be with us, but he has sent a lovely presentation which we'll be playing. Now, of course, those of you who watch this Maternity Midwifery Hour know that what we normally do is put our guests on the spot, and we only have Debbie live, so we only have one person to share her moment of the week. So I wonder if you would, Debbie, welcome, share a moment of the week. And I did spring this on Debbie, I'm afraid.
My moment of the week so far was yesterday morning about 7 o'clock. I went for an open water swim, and it was the first swim that felt really cold. It was cold outside, cold in the water, but there were 2 swans, and they've still got 5 almost grown cygnets that they've brought up through the season. So that was a real moment.
Oh, wow. And that's this open swimming is meant to be very, very healthy.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And I was hearing on the radio, for those who are interested in any sort of swimming, Michael Mosley was talking about swimming being very beneficial in making our veins and arteries more bouncy. He was discussing a piece of research. So you're doing 2 special things. How fantastic is that? No wonder you look so healthy, Debbie.
I heard that too. It was very, very interesting, that programme this morning. Yeah, Michael Mosley. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Well, I'm going to go now on just to explain to people who haven't been with us before, and those of you who have been with us before, you're just going to get that slightly repeated, because I think it's important people know where the Maternity and Midwifery Hour came from. And really it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And you remember when we all locked down, there were no study days, there were no conferences. We weren't meant to be mixing and mingling very easily. We had all the masks and all of that, and the PPE, obviously. And we felt it was really important that midwives and student midwives and people in maternity services, and that was our focus, obviously, and had a way of connecting, of getting information. And at that time, lots of information about COVID, because people needed to know about how to manage it in their own institutions. And we also had a lot of programs where we focused, and we had lovely midwives talking about how they were managing in their units. Really fantastic, some of those early sessions. And this has carried on. I know COVID's still around, but it's not perhaps the issue that it was right at the beginning. But we've found that our audience still like to join us, and they still like to connect in this way. So we've carried on. We're up to now, I'm told by Neil Stewart, who's kind of overall in charge, that we've got about 1,300 sessions. And that's not all from the Maternity and Midwifery Hour, that's also from the Maternity and Midwifery festivals. And anybody who comes to anything with the Maternity Forum will know that everything is recorded, everything is saved up and put into box sets. So if you like this and you want to share with your colleagues, you can do so. You can access everything after the event. So if you wanted to look at some of the things from our early COVID days, you could. You just need to go to Netflix, who kind of curate everything and keep it all in storage. And everything's free to access. And that's a huge thing for midwives and student midwives, especially on a restricted budget. We're all on restricted budgets at the moment. So that's very helpful. Now, if you are doing a project, or you're doing revalidation, or you're doing assignments for college or university, this is a really good place to get up-to-date information. And if you want to have things more targeted, you could subscribe for a month or so and get some targeted box sets, which have lovely reflective activities and all sorts that Jenny Hall curates and looks after, and they're very useful if you're doing something and your time is really precious, and all of us have that from sometimes. So that's available there. We work with all four maternity and the practicing midwives, so you'll see them mentioned quite often in all the things that we do. And I'm just going to say to everybody tonight, thank you for everything you're doing, wherever you are in the world. Actually, I kind of focus on the UK because that's where we are, but I think all midwives, and I know we have a loyal following in America, and also in Nigeria and in Pakistan and India, and I think Norway, I think. So wherever you are, for whatever you're doing, thank you for what you're doing, because you are really important. And I was looking at my lovely, it's not maternity calendar, it's Action for Happiness. And this is on your resource sheet as well, because this gives you a little daily activity. Now, today's activity is free up time by cancelling any unnecessary plans. Now, isn't that delicious? You get rid of that, something you didn't like. But I'm looking at the 30th, which is Saturday. I can't believe it's the end of September already. And it says, and I think we need to be on this one, remind yourself that you're enough just as you are. Doesn't say perfect, you are enough as you are. I just love these things because it just reminds you to just center in on yourself. And it's the mindfulness stuff that we really need to do. So respect midwives and student midwives. Now, also look after yourselves. And I always say that, and I always mean it, because we're really important, and each one of you is important to those women, those babies and families that you care for, as well as the students and everything. Now, also, I need to just remind you, as you're coming into this, if this is the first time, just check out the future sessions, because we have something every week. And next week, we've got Why Understanding Breast Milk Matters. We've got a session on baby loss and helping and supporting women and families, and midwifing through the menopause a bit later. That will be really interesting. Also, writing for publication. So just have a look in the live stream section of where you are now, and you can key in. Again, it's all free to attend, free to register. Now, so news this week, and I'm fairly brief on this one because I would mention the Embrace report, which I mentioned last week, which is still indicating that there's a persistent inequalities for mothers and babies from ethnic minorities and areas of deprivation. And that's still a really useful, in fact, it's a key report we should be reading and really aware of, and really targeting those people and those families properly. But it's not brand new news, but it's news, and it's still on your resource sheet. And I just couldn't resist this one. Big news, NHS uniforms. Did anyone know about this? Well, there's been a big consultation, and there's a whole new set of NHS England uniforms. Now, students are going to be in cloud blue. I can see Debbie looking a little questioning behind the scenes. Midwives are in postman blue with navy trim. Actually, it's quite a nice colour. Healthcare support workers are in lilac with coral contrast. I love the descriptions, actually. And the matrons are in purple. Again, check out the resource folder. And the funny thing is, I know this matters. It matters what you look like and what you're comfortable in. And it's said that it's going to save money. I'm not sure how, but it may do, because if it reduces confusion for people to know who's who, and it actually looks quite a comfortable uniform, to be honest. Anyway, and the other thing out, there's a new report out on the evaluation of the registered midwife degree apprenticeship. That's from the RCM and the NHS England. And again, that is in your resource sheet. Very interesting, because people have now qualified through that route, and it's being evaluated by King's College London. Also, this is one for students. This is one, I'm a tweeter, and I know that it's got a new format thing, but I'm still keeping to my tweets. But a great tweet, and someone I follow is Stella Cottrell, who is an educationalist, and she does a tip every day for students called #SuccessfulStudents. And it's always something good or thought-provoking. And today it's about tackling stress before the start of the year. So this is about a bit of planning. And you know how when you're a new student, at the beginning of the year, you really plan things, and you get that new notebook, and the whole year stretches ahead. And it's only near the end of the year that you start running and rustling and finding out you've run out of time. But it's useful to follow someone like Stella, because there's lots of advice and little tips that are quite manageable. Some of them work, some of them won't work, but I really enjoyed looking at that. Okay, now I've kept my time, and it's 7:10, and I just want to say now, this evening we're looking at Dad's Matter, and we've got Debbie Garrod live, and we've got Mark Williams also presenting. And this is with the context. We know that we look after the mothers and babies. They're our primary responsibility. But who's important to that mother and baby is their partner, the dad, usually dad, but it might be another partner. So we're really pleased to focus on the dads this evening. And so we're going to start with Mark. And now Mark is the founder of Fathers Reaching Out. He was a co-founder of the charity Dad's Matter UK. He's an author, blogger, trainer, and a public speaker. And he founded International Fathers Mental Health Day and the #HowAreYouDad campaign to help ensure that all parents and families are supported throughout the perinatal period. And he's spoken on TV, radio stations, and he's also published quite widely on fathers, and especially on mental health, which is his passion. He's had awards as an Inspirational Father of the Year and Local Hero, and a Point of Light award from the Prime Minister. He's also an ambassador for Mothers charity. He's not able to be with us, as I said earlier, but he has sent a really lovely presentation, and I think it'll just start us thinking about birth and the perinatal period from the father's point of view. So I know Amy is behind the scenes, and she's going to suddenly do magic, and then Mark will appear.
Hi everyone, welcome for tonight's episode, and I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining, also the team behind this as well. So my name is Mark Williams. I'm known for fathers, but I actually campaign for all parents, supporting all parents for their mental health as far better outcomes for the whole family and their child's development. So my work is known for fathers because obviously back when I started, there weren't much awareness or understanding about perinatal mental health for fathers. So obviously I'm an author, published author. I work with Dr. Jane Hanley and other professionals over the years, and come from a lived experience as well. So I'm going to share this story, how I started, and also the growth in it, and also the research around why we should be looking at fathers as well. So my name is Mark Williams, and I'm from a Valleys community. You know, I was man up, get on with it, that sort of thing growing up. And my father was a miner, my grandfather was miners. And I didn't know at the time in school, obviously, I was diagnosed at 40 years of age, but obviously in school I had ADHD and dyslexia. So that impacted on my own self-belief, and I left school at 15, no qualifications. And what we got to think about parents is a lot of parents may have a past history of anxiety, depression, or bipolar, schizophrenia, neurodiversity, that sort of thing. So that's something to be aware of before we become parents as well. My journey really started in mental health when my wife went through a traumatic birth. 22 hours labour, I remember, you know, the doctor money coming in, one coming in, obviously, and the isolation, loneliness, because I was home for 6 months caring for my wife, where there should have been a proper mother-baby unit for her, but not because she had put perinatal mental health services. So my wife was on a ward with people with schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD. She was the only mum on the ward. But we had a really good lady, CPI nurse, Gail James, and she basically set up the first NHS special service in Wales after my wife and other mothers went through. And so a lot of good things came out of something bad. But my wife, for instance, it was a huge shock, because you're in this world where you didn't know anything about postnatal depression. So my wife was actually diagnosed with postnatal depression, severe postnatal depression. So later on, we know that PTSD and postnatal depression overlaps as well, and I'll explain more about it later. So my own mental health was starting to deteriorate. I was exposed to that, and a lot of them don't get that support afterwards as well. So after a couple of days, my wife was really unwell on the ward, and basically clinging out. I was expecting the three of us to leave that day, but only myself. And then it went down a different path, where my wife became very unwell and tried to take her life. And Michelle didn't ever suffer from any depression or anxiety up to that point, I should say. But basically, I was expecting to be back in work in 2 weeks. I was self-employed, the mortgage paying money coming in, one coming in, obviously, and the isolation, loneliness, because I was home for 6 months caring for my wife, where there should have been a proper mother-baby unit for her, but not because she had postpartum psychosis or perinatal psychosis, but she wasn't safe. And so back in nearly 20 years ago, there was no perinatal mental health services. So my wife was on a ward with people with schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD. She was the only mum on the ward. But we had a really good lady, CPI nurse, Gail James, and she basically set up the first NHS special service in Wales after my wife and other mothers went through. And so a lot of good things came out of something bad. But my wife, for instance, it was a huge shock, because you're in this world where you didn't know anything about postnatal depression. So my wife was actually diagnosed with postnatal depression, severe postnatal depression. So later on, we know that PTSD and postnatal depression overlaps as well, and I'll explain more about it later. So my own mental health was starting to deteriorate then as well. I didn't get this initial bond, I was expecting this overwhelming feel of love and come straight away. But when you look at the science around fatherhood, it does take a bit longer sometimes for fathers. So I think that being home for 6 months, I was able to bond skin to skin. I was doing things I self-taught, for instance, so I helped that bond and attachment. But still, I was really unwell, and everything I've seen, and lack of sleep on its own. As parents, we don't talk about enough. Severe lack of sleep can cause, psychosis as well, can't it? So there was a range of reasons why I was starting to get depressed in the postnatal period. Undiagnosed ADHD, lack of sleep, just witnessing a traumatic birth, isolation, loneliness, money worries coming in, suppressing those feelings. And then I was starting to act differently, like avoiding situations, using alcohol. So from the outside world, when I was having bad days, it looked like I wasn't being there, but I was so overwhelmed I couldn't cope with everything was going on in a short space of time as well. So my story goes on, and you can actually see other things online about my own personal story. But what I will say is it changed me as a person. I wasn't the same person going back into my role. And I started changing my job role then. I was in sales and marketing, probably earning more money 96 than I am now, but I had more purpose then. I was like, for instance, okay, I want to change my career. So I went back to the youth club that helped me as a child. And then unfortunately, there was a lot of young suicides in the press in Bridgend and the local area. And I started going on suicide assist courses, mental health courses, started working projects, forensic wards, and I've seen I've seen a lot of horrific things over the years in different projects, but still to this day, thinking my wife and baby was going to die in front of me, was still absolutely horrendous for me and a lot of, especially my wife, of course. So I changed, but I wasn't, again, like mentioned, I wasn't the same person, and I was having my days, and my story does get better. But what I say, I lost my grandfather with dementia, which I was caring for with my family. My mother had cancer within 6 weeks each period. My mother's fine now, but everything I dealt with, everything I experienced as a new father, everything came to a head. And I was physically fit during that time. I was doing a lot of kickboxing, but it was impacting my physical health. And these are some of the signs we've got to look out for, nausea to fix. So your mental health can impact your physical health massively as well. And I had a breakdown. And like in the postnatal period, I was avoiding situations. I couldn't tell my wife how I was feeling because I didn't want to impact on her mental health. I'd drive in the woods and sleep in the car. Depression may be the biggest liar ever. Really took hold of me as well, massively. So I'm in the gym one day, and 8 weeks into my recovery, I was for medication counselling, and after being in a community mental health team, diagnosed after 3 years with ADHD. But what the turning point was, I was speaking to this guy in the gym, and I said, "Can I bother weights?" And he said, yeah, I got to go to NHS Prams. And I said, "Oh, I'm working in a hospital in Cardiff. What's NHS Prams?" And he said, "My wife's got postnatal depression." I said, "No way, my wife had postnatal depression too. No way." So all of a sudden, we opened up a conversation side by side. And it was the first time after 5 years, I realised there was another father who had the same thoughts and feelings that I did as well. And that opened up in 2010-11 to set up a group called Fathers Reaching Out, which is only to support fathers with their partners with postnatal depression. But what we're finding, a lot of mums who phone me up and say, "Mark, I'm fine, but my partner's mental health is impacting on my mental health. He's not singing, reading, dancing, playing with the child." And when you look at the evidence, when dads are depressed, they're less likely to sing, read, dance and play. They're less likely to follow good health guidelines like keeping the baby safe as well. So there's a range of reasons why we should be including fathers in services and asking dads about their mental health. So the biggest killing men under 45 is suicide. And when you look at maternal and the Embrace report, there's high risk of suicide in new mums. So the evidence I'll show you later on explains how high suicide in new fathers is as well. So this group went for 4 years. Dope Black Dads I worked with. I worked in different organizations over the years, different cultures, different beliefs. So I'm very person-centered approach to my work as well. I find out what our father needs and wants. And sometimes it could be a conversation. Sometimes these fathers have made plans to take their lives, and I've had to break confidentiality in that situation as well. So I'm doing an article in, I think it's 2011, and they said, "Okay, we want to share your group. Will you do a little brief story?" And I said, "Yeah, that's fine." So to explain about postnatal depression in fathers, and you can imagine the stigma in 2011. How can men get postnatal depression? We weren't even talking about mental health back then, let alone postnatal depression in fathers. So all of a sudden I'm on TV, radio stations in the UK, and doing radio stations all over the place. And then, it just grew from there, my work. And I believe in post-traumatic growth. So a lot of people can go through trauma. And actually, like my wife now, she works in mental health. She works for a charity for the last 10 years. And that was after my wife's depression came back after caring for me. And my wife was so unwell, she was in crisis team at that point in 2012. And she tried to take her life again. So this is who my work is saying, look, if we get it right during the antenatal period, the perinatal period, the timeline of people is huge. And we can lower adverse childhood experiences as well. A lot of people go for trauma as well. Domestic violence, it goes on and on. When we support all parents during the perinatal period, is huge as well. We only got to look at the 1,001 critical days as well in the baby's brain development as well in that. So so I've done obviously, known for fathers. So I started the campaign in 2013 when the only mother and baby unit closed in Wales. And I spoke up. We had about 14,000 names. And I'm pleased to say the mother and baby unit came back in Tonneneath after 7 years as well. Then I set up International Father's Mental Health Day. And then obviously the articles and the other things came out. There's a film you can see on called Daddy Blues on Amazon Prime about the father's perspective as well. So we know about perinatal mental health years, and a lot of services go up to 2 years. But I want to show you more about fathers as well. Think of mums with postnatal depression, the signs and symptoms. Is there anything that dads can't experience in there as well? Thoughts and feelings, worthiness. Every new thing in mums, can dads experience that as well? The other thing is the biological risk factors, hormones, testosterone, estrogen, cortisol levels, vasopressin actually lowers during this time. So when you look at there's only hormonal, it is actually a change in fatherhoods during this time as well. And the old studies of years ago is 1 in 10. There was 1 in 10 for years for mums. But now when we start screening and assessing dads, we know it's far higher, and the evidence is now coming through. And these are some of the reports, 1 in 3 fathers, 2015, 73% who were worried about their partner's mental health. 39% of fathers wanted support with mental health. 62% of dads felt their mental health difficulties did get away in forging good connection with children. November doing reports now about the isolation and loneliness. A lot of mums get postpartum rage, but of course dads can have that too. It's something to be aware of as well. So why should we screen dads? Look at the evidence by year. A father is up to 47 times more risk of suicide than at any other time in a man's life. And we're not screening and assessing as well. So when you think of it, this is a study me and Scott made done, and 83% of dads felt stressed and anxious. This is about 260 dads we had. But 85% of fathers and partners weren't even asked once about their mental health. So we're not engaging with fathers, so we got the biggest risk of suicide, yet we're not engaging with dads as well. So this is the Sad Dad report, and everything briefly I've talked about impacts on children's emotional behaviours, impacts on partners. Everything is all researched now as well, massively. And this is a dad and baby. So when we start explaining about the bond and how important that attachment is, you can see how the baby's brain and the dad's brain and how it works as well. So there's a range of reasons why we should be engaging dads. We can lower the suicide rates in men especially as well. 1,001 critical days. Make sure you have a look at 1,001 critical days as well. So, like I said, that was a really short presentation, 15 minutes. And if you want to get in touch or ask me any questions, I'll respond. But like I said, my work is never about taking attention away from mum. If nobody was shouting for dads years ago, mums today, I should say, and everyone shout for dads, I'll be more known as a Maternal Mental Health Alliance. And I was part of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance when it first started as well. Thank you.
Well, I think there may have been a few problems with the sound breaking up initially, which I apologise for. Just a few gremlins in the system. We had a few gremlins because we didn't hear all of Mark's session, though I heard it earlier today. So apologies for any disruption of sound. And obviously, Mark's kind of perspective is much more on post-traumatic stress syndrome for mothers and for fathers, and for his experience with perinatal mental health. I mean, I think what it illustrates is that the couple, just like other experiences like grief, will experience things at different times. So that can be very difficult for us to be able to support. Anyway, we're going to move swiftly along now. I'm really delighted to welcome Debbie Garrod, who qualified as a midwife in 1993. She's worked all over in midwifery in several roles, all focused on reducing health inequalities and promoting normal birth. And most recently, she took up her role as a consultant midwife in public health, including professional leadership on all public health issues and leading a range of initiatives designed to promote normality. She works very closely with local authorities, PCTs and third sector organisation and the development of children's centres, midwifery services. She's also been an NCT antenatal teacher since 1982, and she's currently leading on Stockport's strategy to involve service users. Her most recent work, her PhD work, is in research into the needs of pregnant women, looking at midwives and fathers' communication during labour and birth. So, without further ado, I'm going to welcome Debbie. The screen is yours now, Debbie, and thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to take control of the screen, Amy, because my remote isn't working, I'm afraid. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sue, for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak this evening. My CV there is a bit out of date, actually. Over the last 10 years, I've been working as a community midwife and studying for my PhD at the University of Leeds, which I completed in 2021. And as you say, I teach for the NCT as an antenatal teacher, and I've done that since before qualifying as a midwife. And throughout my work as a midwife and an antenatal teacher, I've had an interest in the experiences of fathers and partners. Next slide, please. So the terminology for our session today, my PhD research looked at communication between midwives and fathers, but the findings may apply to same-sex partners, other family configurations and all birth companions. And during this presentation, the midwife is female, as all the midwives were in my study, but I'm aware that midwives also can be male. So next slide, please. So why did I choose to focus on fathers rather than same-sex partners, say, or mothers who are birth supporters or other birth companions? Well, from a historical point of view, childbirth has been women's business until really very recently. It's only in the last 60 or 70 years in the UK that fathers have been allowed, in inverted commas, to be present. Indeed, in the 1950s, we know that even when a baby was born at home, fathers were quite often excluded from their own bedroom where their partner, their wife, was labouring, which seems quite incredible now that somebody wouldn't be allowed to go into a room in their own house. And the research that's grown over the last 20 or 30 years on fathers' involvement and experiences and the roles they play during childbirth, as I say, it's grown exponentially, but most of it, from my literature search, concluded by saying, yeah, fathers may have these experiences which may be traumatic, as Mark's referred to in his presentation just now, and they conclude by saying the midwife's the person who's best placed to address the needs of the father. Next slide, please. I'll just tell you a little bit about how I went about my research before going on to some of the findings. The research question was, how do midwives and fathers communicate during labour and birth? And I used an ethnographic approach, which involved collecting my data through direct observations during labour and birth. And while I was observing as a non-participant, I made notes of what was occurring in terms of communication between the midwife and the father, and also drew some sketches which showed where people were placed in the room, which were very interesting and enlightening. And I'll share some of the findings in this presentation. So I recruited parents during pregnancy, and 11 couples took part in my study. All the women had vaginal births. 3 were assisted with forceps or Ventouse, but all the babies were born vaginally. And the parents, there were 4 first-time parents, 4 second-time, 2 third-time, and 1 fifth baby. And the babies were born in a range of different birth environments. 5 were born in delivery suite, and 2 in maternity theatre. 2 were born in a birth centre, and 2 were born at home. And then after I collected my data in the field, so being present during the labour and birth, I then interviewed the couples and the midwives who looked after them. And I spent a considerable amount of time before I started aware of the study, aware of what they might be invited to participate in, and obviously their right to decide not to participate. Next slide, please. So to analyse my data, and we'll have all the 5 key groups, the findings there. The first were about findings about the midwife-father relationship. The second about how differently fathers and midwives experience the landscape of childbirth. I had some very interesting findings about how different the midwife-father relationship is in different birth environments, and I'm going to talk a bit about that this evening. There were also a group of findings about midwives and fathers' expectations of themselves and each other, and about the birth triad, that's the mother, the father, and the midwife, and its potential for sharing knowledge. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to focus on 3 issues from my research. The first is the nature of midwife-father communications. The second, the impact of birth environment. And the third, how we as midwives and other maternity workers can help fathers and other birth supporters to habituate within an environment which may be familiar to us, but is nearly always unfamiliar to fathers. Next slide, please. So the midwife-father relationship, and this may seem like stating the obvious, but I think it's really worth saying. It is based solely on communication. That's the entirety of the relationship between the midwife and the father. The midwife's relationship with the mother has communication as a very important component, but there are also other clinical aspects of care and responsibility within the midwife's relationship with the mother. With the father, communication is the entirety of the relationship, and that's why it's so important. Next slide, please. So what I found in my research was that non-verbal communications are the foundation of the midwife-father relationship, and this quite surprised me. There were some verbal elements in the relationship, which I've described as chat, banter. Those are the ways in which we as midwives seek to build rapport. So, for example, I witnessed midwives talking to the father about whether did he know what gender the baby was, had they thought about names and so on. And it was sort of quite light-hearted social chat. I also observed midwives giving fathers information and explanation, and also giving information and teaching to student midwives, which was witnessed and absorbed by the father. In the hospital environment, it was almost always initiated by the midwife. So the father would be watching and listening intently to everything that was going on. He'd be looking at the expressions on the midwife's face. He'd be watching attentively as if anybody else came in and out of the room, what they were doing. He'd be glancing around the room at the equipment and maybe things that were unfamiliar, like the resuscitator, but not asking questions. But he'd be listening very intently to what the midwife was saying. And sometimes, if the midwife was talking to the mother and giving words of encouragement, he'd be copying what the midwife was saying. And what he seemed to be doing was working hard to make sense of a very unfamiliar situation. And there was a lot of guesswork and assumption going on rather than him asking questions. So there seemed to be some inhibition on initiating conversation in the hospital environment. Next slide, please. And this is a midwife Lynn, in her interview, talking about how she worked to establish rapport. You go in and introduce yourself and kind of get a feel for the family environment that you're coming across, and then just tentatively try and guess what they want from you and build a relationship that way. I don't quite know, actually. I've never thought about it really. So Midwife Lynn was saying she hadn't thought about how she did that rapport building and getting to know the father, but she does say she was trying to guess what the parents wanted from her. Next slide, please. I've chosen an extract from an interview with a father here, Ricky, having their first baby. They were at this point labouring at home. They were planning to have a home birth, and Ricky said in the interview after the baby was born, it felt like they were concerned that it was going on too long and there might be a problem. They didn't communicate that to me. That's just what I picked up from sort of body language. So he's trying to interpret what was going on. So a bit of guesswork on his part as well. Yes, next slide, please. And this is another father, Donald, having their second baby, describing in the interview how he was sensing what was going on. This sense, I suppose, their demeanour was quite calming as well. The way they communicated with each other was quite reassuring. The midwives might not be very pleased to read this description of themselves, but Donald found it very reassuring. You could tell they'd been round the block. They'd probably been there at hundreds of births, and that for him gave him a feeling of security. And this is, again, fathers picking up what's going on. Next slide, please, there should be a quote on here as well. So as I've said, what I observed was the father being really struck dumb, particularly in the hospital environment, listening attentively, may mimic the midwife, scanning the environment. I noted in a field note the father's eyes, Jack, this is the father Jack, his eyes were darting about. This was during some complications in his partner's labour, and he was clearly trying to sort of figure out what was going on, rarely asking a direct question, waiting to be addressed. Apart from in the home environment, where I observed quite significant differences. Next slide, please. So I've put a picture of a plane there because it struck me quite early on in my observations that it was a bit like being on a flight. In the hospital environment, the father is confined. Years and years ago, we used to talk about mothers confinement and home confinements, and I guess there's echoes of that in this. I felt that the fathers were confined in hospital, like being on a flight, except they didn't know whether they were flying, I don't know, to Barcelona or going to Perth in Australia. So is this a short flight or a long flight? There's absolutely no idea. They don't know where they're going, and they're not sure what their role is, so they're trying to figure it out. But the comparison with being on a flight is that you're in you're in a bit of an unfamiliar environment. You're in a very restricted place. There's limits and restrictions on what you can do, and you can't leave. I observe fathers feeling reluctant to leave and take a break in the hospital environment, and often needing permission to leave. They were apprehensive about leaving, and I think apprehensive about gaining access back into the birth environment. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the differences at home were really interesting. In my study, three of the couples planned to have a home birth, and 2 of the babies were born at home. So I had the opportunity to observe and make comparisons between how midwife-father communication worked at home compared to hospital. At home, the father had the freedom and autonomy to move in and out of the birth environment. And in fact, particularly, I'm thinking about one labour. This was second baby, the first baby being born in hospital. The father was actually not in the room with the woman while she was labouring for most of the labour, until she moved into transition and then into second stage, and then he stayed by her side. But he was available to her if she'd wanted him. The mum was called Lou, and her partner was called Donal, and Donal was occupied with what I called legitimate tasks. He was making cups of tea for people, he was sorting out washing, he was heating up some soup, he was doing sorting out the childcare for their other child. So he had lots of sort of valid, legitimate tasks which fathers don't have in hospital. They have nowhere to go apart from staying with the woman in labour. And this led me to think, you know, if given the choice, would for some couples, perhaps the father wouldn't be by her side all the time, and perhaps that puts pressure on the mother as well, because actually Lou said in her post-birth interview that this experience of birth at home had been better for her because she wasn't worried about how her partner Donal was coping with being in the same room for 12 hours and not having much to do. And she said, I shouldn't be worried about him in labour. And I'm sure we agree she's absolutely right. Next slide, please. So this is a slide showing the continuum of familiarity for the father in the different birth environments that were involved for the couples in my study. Obviously, home is the most familiar environment. Birth centre with less medical equipment visible, hospital delivery suite and maternity theatre being the most unfamiliar environment for most fathers. And this definitely had an impact on how easy and relaxed the fathers were in their communication with the midwife, and how comfortable they felt in initiating communication with the midwife. Next slide, please. So in maternity theatre, the least familiar environment, where there may be an element of emergency and urgency around the baby being born, the couple may land up in maternity theatre, as the couples in my study did, the 2 couples who went to theatre after many hours of labour. So both parents were really exhausted, and then they were transferring to another new environment. And for one of the couples, they transferred from home to a birth centre, to delivery suite, and then to theatre. So they both, and both partners, the mother and the father, had to orientate to these different environments. But what I noticed is the father's state of alert attention really went up and up with each transfer of birth environment. And also in theatre, one birth companion was allowed, and for couples who've had additional birth supporters like a mum or a sister present, that's really deprivation for the father of the person who's been there partly for his support, before going into theatre itself, there was a period of separation from their partner while she went into the anaesthetic room before going into theatre. So that was a time of acute anxiety. And once in theatre, the midwife's attention was really focused on the mother and the least familiar environment for the father. And he had the least support from the midwife because she wasn't able to give him the support because her attention was so much on the mother. And the result was that the father's levels of anxiety and his visible distress increased. And he also reported in post-birth interviews how stressful that time was. Next slide, please. I think we've probably jumped on a few there, Amy. No, we haven't. Apologies. Yeah, next slide, please. So how can we help fathers to habituate? I think it can be really valuable for us as midwives and workers in maternity care to think about our own first experience of childbirth and how did we feel? That whole mix of emotions, the excitement, the strangeness, the unfamiliarity, because as we go on and grow in experience as midwives, we can lose touch with what the perspective is for those who are experiencing birth for the first time. And particularly, we're focusing on fathers here. So for us, through our training, our education, our clinical experience, through our lives as midwives, childbirth becomes very familiar. For the father, even a father who's been present at several labours and births before, birth is still an extraordinary experience. So I hope that through sharing some findings from my research, I've kind of opened the door a bit on the father's perspective of childbirth. Next slide, please. I was really struck by this comment at the top of this slide. This was Mick, were having their third baby, talking about his first experience of childbirth. He said, you just have to get through it. And there's another quote here from Ricky, father of a first baby, describing his experience of labour, one of his vivid memories. The other thing I vividly remember is almost all the way through, Joe's breathing was, exhaling in pain. And when she had the gas and air, it just made it sound so horrible. So like sort of, and he gave a demonstration with a high, long exclamation of pain, but through a tube. So it sounded like more metallic. And I just remember thinking, you've been in pain for so long and you were just shattered. And I was really struck by this comment because how many of us, we're so used to hearing women breathing gas and air. I was so shocked by his perception of what for us is the normal and the everyday, and for him was just extraordinary and really stressful. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder to us, don't assume anything. Because I think one of the findings from my research was that midwives tended to think if a father was having, if it was a second or subsequent baby, they had experience and they didn't need explanations in the same way. And this is Darren, a father, saying, even though it's your second, you still haven't a clue because it's completely different experience because of the fact it was so different. His for the first labour, there'd been lots and lots of intervention, lots of people in the room, lots of equipment. The second labour was just the parents and the midwife, and he found that very different. Next slide, please. Something that fathers would really like us to do is some thinking out loud, even when from a midwifery point of view, everything is normal and going in as we'd hope, in a straightforward way. And this was a father's comment in interview. I was pretty sure Shona, the midwife, had already made her mind up a couple of minutes in advance as to what was probably going to occur next. And he would have liked her to kind of say it out loud. Next slide, please. just some reflections from my point of view as an experienced midwife, but a new researcher when I started on my PhD ethnographic research. It was such a privilege to be present during labour and birth without clinical responsibility, and to be able to really pay attention to what the father was experiencing. It helped me to see with fresh eyes. And next slide, please. I've some questions for us to think about. I'm just aware of time here, and we may not have very long for discussion. But here are some thoughts. How can we encourage fathers to ask questions? How can we discover and negotiate the roles that the couple wish the father to play? What can we learn from the ease of communication at home births? And how can we help fathers to habituate to what is an extraordinary experience in their lives? And there are my contact details, and just a link to my thesis, and a beautiful picture.
And it is a beautiful picture. Beautiful. That's lovely. And thank you so much, Debbie, for sharing that with us. I know it's got a huge amount, I was just enjoying so much listening to you speaking and thinking, gosh, it's this, squeeze it into a tiny time. And as I think it would be lovely if you can come again and kind of tell some more of the stories. And we have had some comments, and I was particularly struck personally when you were talking about the sort of, well, apart from the landscape of the childbirth, when you were talking to the midwife about how she made relationships with the father and how she'd never thought about it before. And I was thinking, well, I've never thought about it before, really, because you just go in and kind of start it off. It was a really very powerful comment to have made at that point. And Emma, thank you, Emma, for making a comment, said, Debbie, this fantastic research validates a lot of theories and experience of what we all need to focus on for partners. Thank you. So she says.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And then we've got a question from Juliet Samuel, and I'm very conscious of the time, and which is very precious. But Juliet Samuel, hi Juliet, says, is there scope for addressing parenting education and sessions specifically for fathers to address the possible feelings of helplessness and perhaps loss of control they sometimes experience?
I'd say most definitely yes, and certainly when I'm working with parents in antenatal groups, I do have some sessions for partners by themselves to look at those issues. I think one of the ways in which my antenatal classes have changed since undertaking this research is, like a lot of other practitioners, I've often said, you know her best, you're her best advocate. But what I hadn't realised is however well a partner knows a woman, the partner doesn't know her in labour. So I wonder whether we're inadvertently contributing to those feelings of helplessness by setting partners up to be advocates and ask questions. And in fact, it's such an extraordinary experience to be present during labour and birth for the first time. This struck dumbness that I witnessed. How are you then going to feel, oh, could I have asked a question at that point? Should I have asked a question? And I wonder whether we should be preparing more for feeling overwhelmed, and this is okay, and this is quite usual, and some strategies for dealing with that.
Yeah, because it actually makes it sound, and I know the questions coming through focusing on the dads, but it's almost focusing on us thinking more about the fathers in a different way, which I think was. And I love the analogy of the plane journey, because that's perfect, actually, especially within the hospital setting, which is potentially quite alien. And it can be, you know, if you think when you go into hospital, I'm addressing the audience really, and you're in a different hospital area, it does feel really alien. I think we have to remind ourselves sometimes of that for our the women and the families and partners. Now we have a thing from Steve Hogarth. Hi, Steve. And he says, how can we encourage midwives to help birth partners prepare for their role?
I think it's about having that conversation. I witnessed midwives asking whether parents had been to antenatal classes and did they have a birth plan, but there wasn't a conversation around what roles do you hope your partner will play? What roles do you hope you'll play? And for example, one couple in my study had decided beforehand that they wanted the father to stay at a physical distance from the mother. That he was going to take a book. He decided, he'd been out with a mate, and a tip that the mate had given was take a book, and if she sees you reading calmly, it'll help her to feel calm. And they talked about that, and this was his strategy. But the midwife was very disconcerted by his physical distance, and she and the student repeatedly invited him with the best intention to kind of come closer into that birth space, and he would politely come in and then leave again. And just a conversation about, have you thought about during the labour, do you want him to be close? Do you want to be close? How comfortable are you with that proximity? Would have helped the midwife to adapt to what that couple particularly wanted, because she was, with the best of intentions, wanting to involve him and for him to be close, but they pre-decided that his place was further away. So I think it's having that conversation. And one clear finding from my study, as Mark said in his presentation, fathers do not want the attention to be taken away from the mother and given to them. They feel almost undeserving of attention. But it's having that conversation. Midwife means with woman, and we're trained to be with the woman, but are we trained to be with the couple? Because it's a different dynamic in communication, isn't it? To have that kind of three-way, or sometimes more if there are other birth supporters there. How can we open that communication up so we include the people who the woman's chosen to have present?
Absolutely, that's a really good point as well. Okay, now I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just going to take a couple of questions and make a couple of comments. Now we've got, and in fact, Juliet Samuel has reflected your words a bit, Debbie, because she said historically has been with women when it should be our focus with couple instead. Great minds, Juliet, great minds. And then Emma says, I'd be interested in how we can broach the topics with partners. I work with very deprived families, and they don't seem vulnerable. I'm not sure quite what Emma means. We might return to that one. And then Teresa Stewart, hi Teresa, says, thank you so much for the information given tonight. I'm just about to embark on my extended project as part of my master's, so I'm all enthused again. So well done, Debbie. You've enthused Sharon.
And good luck.
Excellent.
Good luck.
Fabulous. Okay, and we've got and Sharon Duncliffe says, and the journey for fathers needs to start with the booking appointment to ensure they feel equally part of the journey to parenthood. That's a good point, I think, too. And Jade, hi Jade, says, is there a way of student midwives helping in this situation?
I think absolutely, undoubtedly, yes, and using every opportunity to observe the dynamics that are going on in the birth environment, and just chatting, as we've just been saying, chatting with the parents about how the father wants to be involved. It's always balancing needs, isn't it? It's balancing maybe the need of the mother in labour may be for peace and quiet and not lots of chat. And for the father, it may be for information, reassurance, ideas and tips on things that he can do to help. So it's balancing up the distinct and different needs of the mother and father.
Fabulous. No,
I think one last comment, Sue. One thing that I became aware of through doing ethnographic research was the immense complexity of what we do as midwives, particularly around all the social interaction and the subtlety of the interaction. And I was in awe, and my respect for midwives, I can't express it for the complexity of what midwives do every day and take for granted. Quite amazing.
Well, that's a good comment to be completing with. Thank you, Debbie. I'm just going to say Steve Hogarth is returning here to say, you're right, Debbie, for my data, there were no conversations with the birth partner about their supportive role during labour and birth. It's tokenism. Well, we can change that. And I have to say at this point, I did say to Debbie right at the beginning, this hour goes faster than any hour in the whole week. And what it's saying to me is we need Debbie back to give us some more of this, because I know you've given us so many lovely nuggets to think about, even just from the landscape of childbirth and the flight and the alienness and the home versus hospital issue is such an important one. And I think you highlighted it brilliantly. So a huge thank you to Debbie for joining us today. And I assure the audience we'll have her back either on the maternity hour, if she's able to, if we can twist her on to come back, or on one of the festivals maybe, because then we can have a little bit longer. I know it's a little treat for us all. So thank you to Debbie and Mark. Also Amy, who's in the background making everything running smoothly, and Paul, who's putting the question through to me. Now next week, we've got Denise Gray in Barking, Havering and Redbridge, and Lucy Upton, specialist paediatric dietitian, talking about why understanding breast milk matters. So that's very important for us as midwives to understand. Don't forget to book for the Student Midwife Experience Festival, 8th of November, free to attend for all student and newly qualified midwives and lecturers. And it's got some fantastic speakers, including Flo Wilcox and Kate Greenstock, Jackie Williams. Lots of input from student midwives, be fabulous. The Midwifery Education Conference on the 15th of November, which is all online. There is an individual fee, but you can, if your university's subscribed, you can attend. Very reasonable and very good value. Fantastic speakers again for that. And of course, there's the forthcoming Scottish Festival in Edinburgh on the 28th of November at Murrayfield in Edinburgh. And the programme's coming out for that over the next few days. So if you found this session useful, interesting, come back next week and we'll look forward to seeing you. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us. We'll see you same time, same place next week. And thank you again to Debbie for joining us.
For myself, I think it was really good to speak to some people that obviously we usually wouldn't meet in normal circumstances, especially being up north. We're not quite central, so it was nice to kind of get our opinions and our views across, and to feel like they've been heard.
Even if just speaking to the professionals at the end, so the pop-up signs that you had were fab, which they would have seen online, would they?
I think you just can't beat coming here in person and being able to talk to loads of people that are here and ask all the questions that you need to ask. There's so many benefits to it. You meet lots of people, and it's just a really lovely feeling of camaraderie and interactivity.
So coming here, I feel like I've kind of felt like that I'm not alone in stuff that I'm going through at placement, and from what I've taken away from this is how to go about situations, how to make it better, and how to feel well supported as well. We had some top tips given, so going into placement, I just think I take them on board and try and make the most out of my learning experience.
For me, the main reason I wanted to come was for that networking, for finding my people, the people that are interested in learning about the same things that I'm interested in, and taking those away and sharing them, and because we're on Midwifery Society at our university, and just kind of sharing those with our fellow colleagues and everything. So yeah,
I'm going to be looking back at the things that we've gone through, because there was a lot of content. But I think the joys of now that we can meet face to face, so that's why we really wanted to be here face to face. There is something about meeting other people. So yeah, next time sign up, definitely.